I'm Shane and welcome back to Relative Time. Now the channel's been on a little bit of a hiatus for the last couple weeks, partially because I went on a trip to southern Utah to visit a couple of national parks, which was Bryce Canyon and Zion, which are absolutely beautiful. And on flying back home, I wound up picking up the flu, so I'm close to being 100%, but not quite. Now before I left on that trip, I was planning to have a review of the Glycine Airman done, but I didn't get anywhere near as finished as I wanted to. Yet while I was on that trip, I thought it'd be a good idea to do a quick tutorial on how to actually use a GMT watch to tell multiple time zones. And I especially thought this was a good idea because on that trip, I actually wound up using this Airman to tell 3 different time zones, so I thought it'd make a good example. Now ideally, a GMT watch is best used when you're traveling across the globe. And in this particular instance, each time zone I was keeping track of was only an hour apart. So this isn't exactly the best example, but it's a practical one, and I think it gives you a good idea of how you can use it yourself. But before we get to that, I want to quickly talk about what exactly is a GMT watch, as I think there is some confusion out there. For some people, anything that tells a second time zone is a GMT, and that's not exactly accurate. Now, I'm not sure if there's any true hard definition for a GMT, but for me, the key defining characteristic is that it must have a GMT hand, which is going to be an hour hand that rotates on a 24-hour scale instead of the usual 12. And typically, you'll have the other 3 normal hands, hour, minutes, and seconds. For me, there are 2 types of GMTs. The first is what some people refer to as a true GMT. And in that one, you can independently adjust the hour hand and the GMT hand from each other. And the second is what I refer to as an original GMT. And on that one, the GMT hand is completely slave to the hour hand and can't be adjusted. Now, let me stress that I call them original GMTs, and I'm not sure if anyone else actually does. And that's because they operate like the original GMTs, like the original Rolex GMT Master. If you're a long-term subscriber, you may remember me talking about this a while ago with the Vostok Komandirskie GMT, and that's one I'd call an original GMT. Now, an original GMT does need a 24-hour bezel in order to read a second time zone, while with a true GMT, you frequently have one, but not always. If it does have one, then you also have the ability to read 3 time zones instead of 2. There are 2 different ways to read a second time zone, but before you do that, you first need to set your first time zone. Now, back in the day when these were first used, that first time zone was usually Greenwich Mean Time, or GMT, at least for pilots. And then the second time zone would be whatever their local time that they were flying through. Nowadays, your first time zone is going to be your home time. That way you can use it as a regular watch when not traveling. And when you are traveling, that second time zone again could be your local time zone. Or if you're not traveling, then that second time zone could be whatever friends and family are located or something work related. The true advantage of a GMT is that you can quickly adjust that second time zone without stopping the watch. That way your first time zone always remains in sync to whatever you set it. The first way is to use the 24-hour bezel, and it's simply to rotate that bezel forward or backwards however many hours you need. So if you're in New York and you want to know what time it is in LA, then you simply rotate it ahead 3 hours. Then you just read the GMT hand, but instead of referencing the dial, you reference the bezel. So here, if the GMT hand is at the 10 o'clock on the dial, you then reference the bezel and it's 7 o'clock. The second way is for a true GMT, and it's simply to adjust the GMT hand forward or backwards depending on however many hours you need. And a true GMT, if it has a 24-hour bezel, can read a 3rd time zone, and that's simply to rotate that bezel forward or backwards and again use the GMT hand. So that GMT hand would be used to read both the 2nd and 3rd time zones. For the 2nd time zone, you reference the dial. For the 3rd, you reference the bezel. So for example, last week I went from Dallas to southern Utah, which is an hour behind. So before I even boarded the plane, I adjusted the GMT hand back an hour. Now, while my final destination was southern Utah, I was actually flying in and out of Las Vegas as it's the closest major airport. And what I didn't realize until I landed was that it's on Pacific time, which is actually 1 hour behind Utah, or 2 hours behind Dallas. So once I did arrive, I then adjusted the bezel about 1 hour. And this is the configuration I was then left with. So reading the watch as it is right now, and do bear in mind that while the main hour hand here is on a 12-hour scale, the dial is 24, so it does look a little confusing. So from the normal hour hand, you can see it's 1:09 in Dallas. From the GMT hand on the dial, it's 12:09 in Utah. And from the GMT hand on the bezel, it's 11:09 in Vegas. As I said earlier, GMT watches are really useful when you're trying to keep track of things spread out across the globe. And here, everything is an hour apart, so you could actually very easily do this all in your head. But I think it's a practical example that gives you an idea of what you can do. Anyway, that's the tutorial, and any comments or questions, feel free to leave them down below. Or if you happen to know another way to use a GMT, I would love to hear it, and please leave that down below. In the meantime, that Airman review should be done in the next few days. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you soon.